Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the wildest, most untamed forces the Imperium has ever known. Leman Russ, the Wolf King. Among the Emperor's 20 sons, he was the one who embodied raw, primal instinct like no other. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a beast of war, a storm-given flesh, a force of nature that even his brothers struggled to understand. And if there's one thing that truly defined him, it was his sheer unpredictability. Most Primarchs were brilliant strategists, godlike warriors, or masterful statesmen, each of them a product of their own unique upbringing. But Leman Russ, he was something else entirely. Born on the brutal death world of Fenris, he was raised not among scholars or noble houses, but among wolves and battle-hardened warriors. Where others relied on discipline and grand military doctrine, Russ fought with instinct, raw aggression, and an almost supernatural ability to adapt. His methods were often reckless, his decisions seemingly irrational, and yet he was terrifyingly effective. And that's exactly what made him so hard to predict. While Leman could be relied upon to act with calculated precision, and Dorn with unwavering discipline, Russ could flip the board entirely, shattering expectations with a single feral strike. His enemies never knew what to expect, and sometimes neither did his allies. Was he an uncontrollable beast, or the Emperor's most dangerous weapon? Maybe both. So how did the Wolf King become the most unpredictable of all Primarchs? What was it about his nature, his upbringing, and his choices that made him such an enigma, even to those who knew him best? That's exactly what we're about to uncover. Leman Russ was never meant to be tamed. From the very moment he was cast across the galaxy by the Emperor's great experiment, his fate was sealed. He would never be like his brothers. He wouldn't grow up in the golden halls of an advanced civilization like Leman, or bask in the scholarly wisdom of a refined culture like Magnus. No, Russ was hurled into the cold, merciless grasp of Fenris, a world where survival was the only law that mattered. And it shaped him in ways that no other Primarch could ever understand. Fenris wasn't just a death world. It was a crucible of constant war, where the land itself conspired to kill anything that dared call it home. The planet was a frozen nightmare, its landscape a shifting battlefield of glaciers, volcanic rifts, and savage tundras. The seas churned with monsters, the mountains howled with the wind of endless storms, and the people, those few who managed to carve out an existence, were warriors first, survivors second. There was no room for weakness, no space for diplomacy or subtlety. Life on Fenris was war, from the moment you could walk to the moment you died. And into this world, Leman Russ fell like a star crashing to Earth. Now, here's where things get interesting. Unlike many of his brothers, Russ wasn't found by humans immediately. Instead, the first to discover him were beasts, massive, prehistoric wolves that prowled the snow-choked forests of Fenris. And instead of tearing him apart, they took him in. That alone tells you something about Russ. Primarchs were genetically designed to be superior, but there was something in Russ that went beyond simple biology. He belonged among predators. He was more than a man, more than just another lost son of the Emperor. He was a force of nature, something that even the deadliest creatures of Fenris recognized as kin. Raised by these wolves, Russ became something out of myth. His senses sharpened beyond anything human, his instincts owned by the hunt. He didn't learn to fight in the way warriors of Terra did, through drills, strategy, and discipline. He learned the way a wolf learns, through experience, through the raw, brutal truth of survival. Every battle was real. Every hunt meant life or death. It wasn't about honor or tactics. It was about victory, about claiming your place at the top of the food chain. And then the humans found him. Or rather, they tried to kill him. To the tribes of Fenris, the arrival of Russ was a nightmare made flesh. A creature of impossible strength and speed, a warrior that fought like the gods of old sagas. He tore through their strongest, shrugged off their weapons, and in time, rather than trying to destroy him, they did the only thing that made sense. They bowed before him. Russ didn't just become a warlord. He became a legend. He took control of the tribes not through politics, not through conquest in the traditional sense, but through sheer dominance. His presence alone commanded loyalty, his raw power making any challenge futile. And unlike some of his brothers who would later struggle to understand the cultures they ruled, Russ thrived. Fenris wasn't something he had to adapt to. it was an extension of himself. This is where a lot of fan theories come into play. Some argue that Russ's unpredictability wasn't something that developed later. It was always a part of him because of Fenris. Unlike Dorn or Guilliman, who were raised in structured societies with rules and hierarchies, Russ grew up in a world where chaos and instinct dictated everything. His leadership wasn't based on grand strategies or careful calculations. It was about reading the moment, feeling the fight, knowing when to strike and when to fall back. Not because of a plan, but because of a deeper, more primal understanding of war. And that's why so many of his later actions confused even his brothers. To them, he seemed reckless, wild, impossible to predict. But for Russ, it wasn't recklessness. It was instinct, a way of thinking that didn't fit within the rigid doctrines of the Imperium, but one that had been proven time and time again on the battlefields of Fenris. So, did Fenris make Leman Russ the most unpredictable Primarch? Absolutely. It forged him into something the Imperium could barely comprehend. A warrior whose mind didn't work like a man's, but like a predator's. And that's something no amount of strategy can counter. When the Emperor finally set foot on Fenris, he wasn't just searching for another lost son, he was walking into a world that had already bent the knee to Leman Russ. Unlike other Primarchs, who were raised in civilizations with rulers, advisors, and councils, Russ was the absolute master of his domain. He wasn't a prince waiting to be crowned, he was already a king. And that made his meeting with the Emperor unlike any other. Most Primarchs, when found, had some instinctive recognition of the Emperor's authority. Some were awed by him, others immediately swore fealty, and a few resisted, but none greeted the master of mankind the way Leman Russ did, with a challenge. Not a conversation, not a test of loyalty, but a straight-up, no-holds-barred contest of dominance. Because to Russ, that was the only way to measure a man. Words meant nothing. Power, strength, and the ability to stand victorious, that was what mattered. Now, let's just take a moment to appreciate how absurdly audacious that was. Imagine the Emperor, a being so unfathomably powerful that even his mere presence made mortals tremble, walking into a barbarian king's hall, only to have that king basically say, "You want me to follow you? Prove you deserve it." Any other warlord in the galaxy would have been vaporized on the spot for such insolence. But the Emperor didn't strike Russ down, he accepted the challenge. And this is where the saga turns into something straight out of a legend. Russ didn't just propose a duel. No, that would have been too predictable. Instead, he declared that they would settle things through a series of contests, each one designed to test a different kind of strength. First, they drank. Because of course they did. Russ, being Fenrisian to the core, believed that true warriors could measure each other in a drinking contest. It was as much a test of endurance as it was of willpower. And here's the crazy part. The Emperor, the most advanced being in human history, lost. Or at least he played along enough to let Russ think he had won. Then came the eating contest. Again, pure, raw excess. Russ devoured entire beasts, downing food as if he were a starving wolf. The Emperor? He ate. But he wasn't about to out-glutton a man who had lived his entire life feasting like a warrior of legend. Once again, Russ claimed victory. But then, the real challenge came. The fight. And this is where the true nature of Leman Russ shone through. Any other Primarch, after 2 victories, might have felt smug, might have assumed that the Emperor was just another warlord to be outdone. But Russ, despite his pride, was no fool. He had spent his entire life testing the strength of others. And he knew the real challenge was yet to come. When they finally clashed, it was over in an instant. Russ charged, and the Emperor flattened him. No hesitation, no drawn-out battle, just sheer, undeniable proof of who was the greater warrior. It wasn't even close. And here's where Russ showed his true unpredictability. He didn't rage, he didn't deny it, he didn't even try to get up and demand a rematch. Instead, he laughed. Because for all his pride, all his dominance, Russ understood strength when he saw it. He recognized the Emperor as something beyond him, beyond anything he had ever faced. And instead of resisting, he embraced it. Just like that, he swore loyalty, not because he was beaten, but because he had finally found someone worth following. This whole story is a perfect encapsulation of why Leman Russ is so unpredictable. Most warriors would either submit or resist. They would see the emperor and either bow immediately or try to fight to the bitter end. But Russ, he played games. He tested the waters. He challenged not just with his fists, but with his spirit. He needed to know on every level that the man claiming to be his father was worthy of that claim. And when he got his answer, he didn't sulk or scheme. He accepted it with the same wild, untamed energy that had defined his entire life. And this is why so many fan theories suggest that the emperor didn't just see a warrior in Russ. He saw something entirely unique. Russ was a creature of instinct, of raw, primal understanding. He wasn't the most disciplined, the most intelligent, or even the most powerful of the Primarchs, but he was the most in tune with the nature of power itself. He could sense it, measure it, test it, and in the end, respect it when he found it. So was this meeting a spectacle? Absolutely. Was it reckless? Without a doubt. But that's the thing about Leman Russ. He was never going to be anything else. He was never meant to follow the traditional path of a Primarch. He was the wolf who tested the storm, the warrior who laughed in the face of defeat, and the king who bowed only when he found someone stronger. And that, more than anything else, is why his story is one of the wildest in all of Warhammer 40k. Leman Russ was never the type to sit in war councils and trade pleasantries with his brothers. He wasn't like Guilliman, who could navigate politics as easily as battlefields, or like Sanguinius, whose mere presence could inspire loyalty and unity. Russ was different. He was raw, instinctive, and impossible to predict. To some of his brothers, that made him fascinating. To others, it made him infuriating. And for a few, it made him outright dangerous. Among the Primarchs, Russ was an outsider, not because he wanted to be, but because his very nature set him apart. He wasn't raised in a structured civilization like the others. He wasn't trained in grand strategies or noble philosophies. He grew up in the wilds of Fenris, where strength ruled and instinct decided who lived and who died. That shaped how he saw the world. He didn't trust words, he trusted action. He didn't care for endless debates, he cared for results. And for some of his brothers, that approach was impossible to understand, let alone tolerate. No relationship better defines Russ's conflicts with his kin than his rivalry with Magnus the Red. If ever there were two Primarchs destined to clash, it was these two. Magnus was all about intellect, wisdom, and arcane power. He believed in knowledge, in the pursuit of deeper truths, in unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Russ, on the other hand, was all about instinct. He didn't trust books or ancient tomes. He trusted what he could see, what he could feel. To Russ, Magnus was everything that was dangerous about unchecked ambition, a being who saw himself above the laws of nature. And to Magnus, Russ was a brute, a warrior too stubborn to see the bigger picture. Their fights weren't just about ideology, they were personal. Russ saw Magnus as reckless, arrogant, and blinded by his own intelligence. Magnus saw Russ as primitive, close-minded, and incapable of understanding anything beyond war. It was more than just philosophical differences. It was pure, fundamental incompatibility. And when their rivalry finally exploded into war with the burning of Prospero, it wasn't just a battle between legions. It was the culmination of years of mistrust, resentment, and perhaps even a twisted form of respect. Because for all their hatred, neither could ever completely dismiss the other. They were two sides of a coin, forever locked in opposition. Then there was Rogel Dorn. If Magnus represented the mind in contrast to Russ's raw instinct, then Dorn represented order in opposition to Russ's chaos. Dorn was rigid, disciplined, a builder of fortresses and empires. He saw war as something that could be controlled, calculated, perfected. Russ, he saw war as a storm, unpredictable, wild, something that had to be embraced rather than tamed. Their clashes weren't as explosive as those between Russ and Magnus, but they were just as tense. Dorn couldn't stand Russ's recklessness. Russ couldn't stomach Dorn's obsession with order. And then, of course, there was the infamous duel with Lionel Johnson. If there was ever a moment that captured the sheer unpredictability of Leman Russ, it was this one. The two Primarchs fought side by side during the campaign on Dulan, but their different approaches to war inevitably led to tension. The Lion, cold and methodical, saw things in terms of strategy and logic. Russ, ever the warrior king, saw things through the lens of honor and instinct. When the Lion ended the war by striking down the enemy leader in a single decisive blow, something Russ believed should have been done in single combat. The Wolf King was furious. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Russ, in typical Russ fashion, laughed it off at first, thinking it was all just a warrior's game. The lion, however, didn't see it that way. Without warning, he punched Russ in the face, knocking him out cold. And here's the best part. Russ didn't retaliate. He didn't rise up in anger. He didn't demand vengeance. Instead, when he woke up, he laughed. Hard. He saw the entire thing as a joke, as just another test of strength between warriors. But the lion? He didn't see it that way. He stormed off, and their relationship was never quite the same again. That's the thing about Russ. His brothers never quite knew what to do with him. He wasn't predictable like Leman. He wasn't a steadfast bulwark like Dorn. He wasn't an untouchable demigod like the lion. He was wild, chaotic, and entirely his own creature. Some, like Horus, saw this and admired him for it. Others, like Magnus, despised it. And a few, like Dorn, simply found it frustrating. But that's exactly what made Russ so unique. He didn't fit into the grand puzzle of the Imperium the way the others did. He was the wild card, the warrior who fought not because he was ordered to, but because it was in his blood. And while that may have alienated him from some of his brothers, it also made him one of the most feared and respected among them. Because no one, not Leman, not Dorn, not even Horus, could ever truly predict what Leman Russ would do next. And in a galaxy where so much was driven by cold logic and ruthless efficiency, that made him one of the most dangerous Primarchs of them all. Leman Russ didn't wage war like his brothers. He didn't write grand treatises on strategy like Leman. He didn't build unbreakable fortresses like Dorn, and he didn't orchestrate shadowy assassinations like Korax. Russ fought like a storm, unpredictable, relentless, and utterly devastating. To the untrained eye, his approach to battle seemed like chaos, a whirlwind of violence with no clear structure or order. But that was exactly why it worked. Where others relied on meticulous planning, Russ relied on instinct. He didn't need to spend weeks analyzing terrain or drawing up elaborate formations. He could read a battlefield the way a wolf reads its prey. He saw weaknesses before they became obvious. He knew when to press forward and when to fall back. And he understood that sometimes the best strategy wasn't about control, but about letting go and embracing the raw, primal nature of war. His warriors, the Space Wolves, mirrored this philosophy perfectly. Unlike the rigid, disciplined formations of the Ultramarines or the iron-willed ranks of the Imperial Fists, the Space Wolves moved with an almost organic fluidity. They struck fast, tearing into the enemy before they even had a chance to react. They fought with a kind of brutal efficiency that made them seem reckless, but in reality, every move was calculated, just not in the way traditional tacticians understood. Russ believed that war was not a game of numbers and logistics. It was a test of will, a battle of instincts. He knew that battles weren't won by sitting behind walls or waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were won by acting, by pushing forward with overwhelming force and breaking the enemy before they could even comprehend what was happening. And that's exactly what made him so terrifying. To his allies, Russ was an unstoppable force, a leader who inspired absolute loyalty, not because of grand speeches or careful manipulation, but because he led from the front. He didn't just send his warriors into the fray, he was there with them, tearing through the enemy with the same unrelenting fury. His warriors followed him because they knew he would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. Most Primarchs had predictable patterns of warfare. The Ultramarines would use their perfect formations. The Iron Hands would grind down their foes with overwhelming firepower. The Raven Guard would strike from the shadows. But Russ, you never knew what he was going to do. One moment, his forces would be scattered, seemingly disorganized, like a pack of lone wolves hunting their own prey. The next, they would strike as one, a perfectly timed assault that shattered the enemy's lines before they could even react. This unpredictability made Russ both respected and feared among his brothers. Leman, with his obsession for structure, saw it as recklessness. Dorn, with his unshakable discipline, saw it as undisciplined fury. But those who truly understood Russ knew the truth. He wasn't undisciplined. He wasn't reckless. He simply understood war in a way that others didn't. There's a popular theory among fans that Russ's approach to battle wasn't just about instinct, it was about psychological warfare. He didn't just fight battles physically, he fought them mentally. By being unpredictable, by keeping both his enemies and his allies on edge, he forced others to react to him rather than the other way around. He dictated the flow of battle, keeping everyone off balance and ensuring that no one could ever truly plan for what he was going to do next. That's why so many of his campaigns were so brutally effective. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he overwhelmed them, shattered them, broke their spirits before they even had a chance to fight back. He made them feel hunted, made them second-guess every move they made. It wasn't just about strength, it was about control in a way that didn't look like control at all. Even among the Primarchs, Russ was a warrior first. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a statesman, and he certainly wasn't someone who cared about the finer points of diplomacy. But on the battlefield, he was a master. And while his brothers may have dismissed him as a savage, as a brute who didn't understand the so-called higher aspects of war, the truth was that Russ understood something they never could. That war isn't about order. It's about dominance. About knowing when to strike, when to hold back, and when to unleash absolute fury. And that, more than anything else, is why he was the most unpredictable warrior among them. He didn't play by the same rules. He made his own. And in a galaxy where rigid structure and cold logic often failed, sometimes it was the wild, untamed beast that won the day. Leman Russ wasn't just the leader of the Space Wolves. He was the Space Wolves. Other Primarchs led legions that followed their vision, their doctrine, their carefully crafted strategies. Russ, though? His legion wasn't just shaped by his ideas, it was an extension of his very being. The Space Wolves didn't just fight like their Primarch. They thought like him, lived like him, were him in every meaningful way. To truly understand Russ as a leader, you have to understand how different his approach was. He wasn't a distant ruler, commanding from atop a throne of gold, issuing orders like some warlord separated from his troops. He wasn't a cold tactician, seeing his warriors as pieces on a grand galactic chessboard. He was a king in the old mythic sense. A warrior king who stood shoulder to shoulder with his men, who led not by decree, but by presence. His warriors followed him not because they were conditioned to obey, not because they were trained to submit to hierarchy, but because they wanted to, because they believed in him. Russ wasn't infallible, and he never pretended to be. He made mistakes, he acted on impulse, he let his emotions guide him. But that's exactly why his warriors trusted him. He wasn't some distant, untouchable god. He was real. He was one of them. And that's why the Space Wolves were unlike any other legion. Where the Ultramarines had their rigid structure and codex-driven efficiency, the Space Wolves had instinct. Where the Imperial Fists had their unbreakable discipline, the Wolves had unshakable brotherhood. To them, battle wasn't just about winning, it was about proving themselves. About facing the enemy eye to eye, feeling the thrill of combat, earning every victory. Russ instilled in them a sense of pride that went beyond duty. He didn't want mindless soldiers who followed orders without question. He wanted warriors. Warriors who could think for themselves, who could trust their instincts, who could fight without fear and without hesitation. He gave them freedom, but that freedom came with responsibility. A Space Wolf didn't fight because he had to. He fought because it was who he was. But with that pride came an unshakable sense of duty. Russ might have been the wildest of the Primarchs, but he wasn't reckless when it came to the things he valued, and above all else, he valued his pack. His wolves weren't just soldiers under his command. They were his family, his brothers, his sons, and he would do anything to protect them. This was both his greatest strength and his greatest flaw. Because while his loyalty to his warriors made him a leader they would follow to the ends of the galaxy, it also meant that he took every loss personally. Where Guilliman or Dorn might see war in terms of strategy, logistics, and acceptable casualties, Russ felt every death. Every fallen wolf was a wound that never truly healed, and that, more than anything else, shaped the way he led. He fought with his legion, bled with them, mourned with them, and because of that, he was willing to make choices no other Primarch would. If it meant protecting his own, he would abandon grand strategies, defy orders, break the rules of war itself. Some saw this as his greatest flaw, proof that he was too emotional, too human for the cold, calculated brutality of galactic conquest. But others saw it as his greatest strength. Because in a war-torn universe, where life meant little and duty often demanded the unthinkable, Russ cared. There are countless stories of Russ going to extreme lengths to protect his warriors, of him throwing himself into battles he shouldn't have, not because it was strategically sound, but because he refused to leave his wolves behind. Some say it made him weak. Others say it made him the only Primarch who truly understood what it meant to be a leader. Not a ruler, not a conqueror, but a leader. And here's where things get interesting. There's a theory among fans that Russ's deep connection with his warriors wasn't just a byproduct of his personality, it was by design. The Emperor didn't create 20 identical Primarchs, he shaped each one to fulfill a role. And Russ? He was meant to be loyalty incarnate. The Space Wolves were never just another legion. They were the Emperor's executioners, his enforcers, the ones who would bring down any of their brothers who strayed too far. But the only way Russ could be that was if he understood the weight of that duty. If he knew what it meant to love his warriors, so that when the time came to strike down his own kin, he would understand exactly what it cost. That's why, when you look at Russ's legacy, you don't just see a warrior, you see a protector. A king who would do anything for his people. A Primarch who, despite his wild, untamed nature, carried the burden of leadership heavier than most. Some call him a savage, a beast, an uncontrollable force of destruction. But the truth? He was always more than that. He was the embodiment of brotherhood, of loyalty, of the raw, unbreakable bond between warriors who fight and die together. And in the end, that's why he was so unpredictable. Because while others fought for duty, for strategy, for victory, Russ fought for something far more primal. He fought for his pack. And in a galaxy where loyalty was often just another word for obedience, he proved that it could be something far more powerful. Something that could shake the very foundations of the Imperium itself. The burning of Prospero is, without a doubt, the most controversial event in Leman Russ's entire life. It's the moment that defines him for many, the event that cemented his reputation as the Emperor's executioner, as a brute who brought fire and ruin to one of his own brothers. But was it really that simple? Was Russ just an uncontrollable beast unleashed to tear Magnus and his legion apart? Or was there something deeper at play, something far more tragic? To understand what happened on Prospero, you have to go back to the root of the conflict between Russ and Magnus. These two were always destined to clash. Magnus, the scholar, the sorcerer, the seeker of forbidden knowledge. Russ, the warrior, the pragmatist, the enforcer of the Emperor's will. They were polar opposites in almost every way, and while some opposites complement each other, these two only ever seemed to push each other further apart. When Magnus made his fateful decision to use sorcery to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, he sealed his fate. The Emperor had already forbidden the use of psychic power outside of strictly controlled means, and Magnus, despite his good intentions, had broken that commandment in the most dramatic way possible. Instead of sending a simple message, he shattered the psychic wards of the Imperial Palace and unleashed devastation across Terra. That was it. The Emperor had to act. And this is where Russ enters the picture. Initially, he was sent to bring Magnus to heel, to take him into custody so that he could face judgment. But then Horus, already corrupted by chaos, intervened. He whispered to Russ, feeding into his instincts, twisting his orders just enough to change everything. Instead of capturing Magnus, Russ now believed he had to destroy him. So the Space Wolves descended on Prospero like a storm. They didn't come to negotiate. They didn't come to offer Magnus a chance to explain himself. They came to end him. What followed was nothing short of a massacre. The Thousand Sons, unprepared for the sheer fury of the wolves, were torn apart. Their libraries, their temples, their entire way of life reduced to ash. And at the heart of it all was Russ, leading the charge, bringing ruin to a world that had once been his brother's home. And this is where the real debate begins. Did Russ have to do it this way? Was this the only outcome? Or did he let his hatred, his rivalry with Magnus, cloud his judgment? Some argue that Russ was played for a fool. that Horus manipulated him, knowing that he was a weapon that, once pointed in the right direction, would never stop. And there's truth to that. Russ was always a warrior who followed instinct over deliberation. He trusted his gut, and his gut told him that Magnus was a threat. The fact that Horus nudged him in that direction only made it worse. Others believed that Russ knew what he was doing but saw no other way. He wasn't just some mindless berserker. He understood the weight of what he was about to do. But in his mind, the Thousand Sons had already sealed their fate. If Magnus had defied the Emperor so openly once, what was to stop him from doing it again? If he had been willing to break the laws of the Imperium for what he thought was the greater good, then what else was he willing to do? Russ might have seen himself as the lesser evil, the one who had to do the unthinkable before things got even worse. And then there's the third perspective, the one that suggests that Russ, deep down, regretted all of it. That he didn't want to bring Magnus down like this, that he had been caught in the tides of war and manipulation, unable to stop what had already begun. There's a popular theory among fans that when Russ and Magnus finally fought, and Magnus was on the verge of death, Russ hesitated. That in that moment, he saw the tragedy of it all. Saw his brother not as an enemy, but as someone he had once called kin. And that's why Magnus was able to escape into the warp, because Russ, for all his ferocity, let him go. No matter which way you look at it, the burning of Prospero changed Leman Russ forever. Before this, he was feared, yes, but he was also respected. He was the Wolf King, the warrior king of Fenris, a leader of men and wolves alike. But after Prospero, he became something else, a weapon, an executioner, a force of destruction unleashed by the Emperor whenever something needed to be wiped off the map. And that's the real tragedy. Because Russ was never meant to be a mindless killer. He was always more than that. He had honor, loyalty, and a deep sense of duty. But Prospero stripped him of all of that in the eyes of many. It made him a monster in the eyes of those who didn't understand him, a brute who could never be trusted. And maybe, just maybe, it made him question himself too. So was it a mistake? Could he have done something different? Maybe. Maybe if he had slowed down, if he had questioned Horus's orders, if he had truly listened instead of reacting, things might have gone another way. Maybe the Thousand Sons could have been saved, maybe Magnus could have been reasoned with, maybe war could have been avoided. But that wasn't who Russ was. He acted, he fought, he led. And sometimes that meant making choices that couldn't be undone. The real question is, did he regret it? And if he did he ever admit it to himself? That's something we'll probably never know. But one thing is certain. After Prospero, Leman Russ was never the same again. After Prospero burned, after the Thousand Sons were shattered and Magnus vanished into the warp, Leman Russ didn't celebrate. There were no great feasts, no howls of triumph, no pride in what had been done. And that tells you everything you need to know about him. Russ was a warrior, a killer when he had to be, but he was never a butcher. And Prospero? That felt like butchery. The victory should have felt like a triumph, but instead it left a scar. Even among his own legion, there was an unspoken tension, a question that few dared to ask outright. Was this right? The Space Wolves were brutal, yes, but they fought for honor, for purpose. The burning of an entire world, the slaughter of an entire brotherhood, the destruction of a legion that had once fought beside them, it didn't feel like a warrior's battle. It felt like something else, something darker. Russ didn't dwell on things the way Magnus did. He wasn't one to agonize over the past or lose himself in endless self-reflection. But even he couldn't just walk away from what had happened. And deep down, something shifted. In the immediate aftermath of Prospero, Russ threw himself into the war harder than ever. Maybe it was to drown out the doubts. Maybe it was to prove to himself and to his warriors that what they had done had been necessary. He led his wolves across the stars, hunting down the enemies of the Imperium with renewed fury. He became the Emperor's enforcer in a way he never had before, striking down those who strayed too far from the path. But it was different now. There was a weight behind his actions that hadn't been there before. Russ had always fought with passion, with fire, with the unbreakable will of a warrior king leading his pack. But after Prospero, there was something colder, something more deliberate. It was as if he had seen what happened when war lost all sense of honor, and he was desperate to never let it happen again. Then came the real test, when the galaxy was torn apart by the Horus heresy. Russ was never one to doubt the Emperor. For all his wildness, for all his rebellious nature, he was fiercely loyal. But now that loyalty took on a new form. He wasn't just fighting for the Emperor's vision, he was fighting to prevent another Prospero. That's the real tragedy of what happened. Because for all the talk of Russ being a force of chaos, of destruction, of pure, unrelenting violence, he learned from his mistakes. He saw what had happened, and he did not want it to happen again. Some of his brothers fell to darkness, others lost themselves in rage or despair. But Russ, he became something else. He became the hunter. During the heresy, he turned his fury on Horus's forces like never before. Where some legions were shattered and scattered, the Space Wolves endured. They became the Emperor's hounds, tracking down traitors, tearing through the forces of chaos with relentless precision. And Russ, he was at the front, leading the charge, his past mistakes fueling him just as much as his loyalty did. There are stories, whispered legends among his warriors, that Russ was looking for something more than just revenge. That he wasn't just hunting down traitors, he was hunting for redemption. Not for himself necessarily, but for the Imperium, for the ideals that he had once believed in so fiercely. Because in his mind, Prospero had proven one thing beyond all doubt: when war is waged without honor, it destroys everything. One of the biggest theories among fans is that Russ's transformation after Prospero wasn't just about guilt, it was about purpose. That before, he had been a warrior, a king, a brother among equals. But after Prospero, he saw himself as something else entirely. A guardian, a being who had to do whatever it took to stop the Imperium from descending into the kind of madness that had led to that terrible day. And that's what makes his story so compelling. He didn't run from his past, but he didn't let it define him either. He took the pain, the anger, the regret, and he turned it into something that drove him forward. While others broke, while others lost themselves, he kept going. Not because he had no doubts, but because he did. And that, more than anything else, is what makes him one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in the entire saga. Because no matter how far he went, no matter how many enemies he tore apart, no matter how many victories he won, the shadow of Prospero was always there, following him, haunting him. And in the end, maybe that's why he disappeared. Not because he was running, not because he was afraid, but because he knew, deep down, that he had one last hunt to complete, one last battle to fight, one final truth to uncover. And that's where the real mystery of Leman Russ begins. Leman Russ didn't die. He didn't fall in battle. He didn't vanish in some final act of defiance against chaos. And he certainly didn't go out quietly. He left. And to this day, no one truly knows why. Of all the missing Primarchs, his disappearance is the most legendary, the most mysterious, and perhaps the most frustrating. Because if there's one thing everyone can agree on, it's that Russ wouldn't just abandon his wolves, his people, or the Imperium itself, not unless there was a damn good reason. The official tale, the one the Space Wolves tell over their drinking horns and battle feasts, is simple. One day, without warning, Leman Russ stood before his warriors and declared that he was leaving, that he had a final battle to fight, a last hunt that only he could complete. He gathered his most trusted warriors, his Einherjar, the best of the best, and then he was gone. Just like that. No explanations, no dramatic goodbyes, no final orders. And he hasn't been seen since. That, of course, has led to an endless number of theories. Some say he ventured into the Eye of Terror itself, hunting for answers, or maybe even looking for Magnus one last time. Others believe he went searching for the cure to the genetic flaws within his legion, the slow, creeping corruption of the Canis Helix that had begun to take its toll. And then there are those who whisper that he didn't leave for himself. He left because he saw something coming, something even worse than Horus, something that he alone could stop. One of the most popular theories among fans is that Russ knew the Emperor's true fate long before anyone else did. That he realized the master of mankind would one day be reduced to a corpse throne, and that the Imperium would slowly rot from within. Maybe he saw what Guilliman sees now. The corruption, the stagnation, the betrayal of everything they once fought for. And instead of standing by and watching it happen, he chose to leave. Not in surrender, not in exile, but in preparation. Because one day he will return, and that's the part that makes his disappearance so different from, say, the Lion or Corax. Those Primarchs vanished into legend, but there's a finality to their stories. With Russ, though, it's different, because he didn't just disappear. He promised to return. The legend of the Space Wolves speaks of the Wolf Time, a final, apocalyptic battle where Russ will come back to lead his warriors once more. It's not just some vague myth. It's a prophecy, one that the Space Wolves believe in with absolute certainty. But what exactly is the Wolf Time? Is it just a metaphor, a way for the Space Wolves to keep hope alive? Or did Russ really foresee something? A future so grim that he knew he had to remove himself from the board, waiting for the exact moment when he would be needed most. Some believe he's still out there, somewhere in the warp, fighting a war that no one else can see. There are stories, whispered tales of a ghostly warrior appearing in the darkest corners of the galaxy, a being clad in furs and armor, striking down the forces of chaos with the fury of a god. A lone hunter, never staying in one place for long, always moving, always searching. Could it be Russ? Or is it just the wishful thinking of those who refuse to accept that he might be gone forever? Then there's the idea that Russ doesn't want to return. At least, not yet. That maybe he saw something in the warp, something that changed him. Some theorists even suggest that he's been trapped somewhere, held back by forces beyond even his strength. Could he be fighting on some lost battlefield in the Immaterium, locked in an endless struggle against daemons, waiting for the right moment to break free? And here's the real kicker. What if Russ does return, but he's not the same? We've seen what happens to Primarchs who spend too long in the warp. Magnus fell, Lorgar fell. Even those who resisted, like Guilliman, came back changed. If Russ has truly been lost in the immaterial realm for all this time, what has he become? Would he still be the same Wolf King or something far more dangerous? No one knows the answer. Not yet. But one thing is certain. Russ left for a reason. And if he does come back, it won't be as some weary old warrior returning home. It will be as the storm that no one saw coming, the final piece in whatever grand game the Emperor set into motion all those millennia ago. Because if there's one thing about Leman Russ that's always been true, it's that he's unpredictable. And if history has taught us anything, it's that when the Wolf King finally returns, it won't be in the way anyone expects. Leman Russ may be gone, but his presence is everywhere. His name is still spoken across the galaxy, his deeds are still remembered, and his warriors, the Space Wolves, still carry his legacy like a burning brand. Unlike many of his brothers, whose legacies have been twisted, forgotten, or buried beneath layers of imperial propaganda, Russ remains a figure of legend, both feared and revered. But what does that legacy really mean? What has the Wolf King left behind? First and foremost, there's the Legion, or rather, the Chapter, as they are now known. The Space Wolves have never been like other Space Marines, and that's because Russ was never like other Primarchs. The rigid structure of the Codex Astartes, the carefully maintained traditions of other chapters. The Wolves ignore all of it. They fight in their own way, they train in their own way, and they live in their own way. They are a brotherhood first, a military force second. Even now, 10,000 years after Russ vanished, his warriors still think of themselves as his sons, his pack. They don't just fight for the Imperium. They fight for him. That alone makes them stand apart. Because while other chapters have long since become tools of the Imperium, cogs in an unfeeling machine, the Space Wolves have never fully surrendered to that fate. They remain outsiders, just as their Primarch was. They still question orders. They still trust their instincts over bureaucracy. They still believe that honor and loyalty matter more than doctrine and rules. And that makes them dangerous. It makes them unpredictable, just like Russ. But Russ's legacy isn't just about the Space Wolves. It's about the idea of him, what he represents. Even in a galaxy where gods and monsters walk, where heroes rise and fall, Leman Russ stands apart. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't the most powerful, or the most intelligent, or the most cunning, but he was the most human. He felt deeply. He fought with passion. He made mistakes, but he never stopped moving forward. That's why he's still remembered, not just as a warrior, but as a man. And in a universe where humanity is increasingly swallowed by bureaucracy, corruption, and blind faith, that means something. The Imperium preaches obedience above all else, but Russ never obeyed. He chose. He chose to fight, to lead, to stand by his brothers, even when it cost him everything. And that spirit, that defiance, is something that still echoes through the Space Wolves and beyond. There's also the question of what comes next. Russ didn't just disappear. He left behind a promise, the Wolf Time. The prophecy that says one day, when the galaxy is at its darkest, when the Imperium is on the brink, he will return. It's a myth, but it's also a warning. Because if the Space Wolves still believe in that prophecy, if they still think Russ will come back, then that means they also believe that things will get worse. And if that time does come, what happens then? There's a theory that Russ's return won't just be about saving the Imperium. It'll be about changing it. That he won't come back to kneel before the High Lords of Terra or to blindly serve a decayed empire built on stagnation. No, if Russ returns, it will be on his terms. Maybe he'll lead a final charge against chaos. Maybe he'll burn the rot out of the Imperium itself. Or maybe, just maybe, he'll shatter everything and rebuild it in his own image, a vision of the Imperium that never lost its way. But even if he never returns, his legacy endures. The Space Wolves still carry his name. His legend still inspires warriors across the galaxy. And his story, his defiance, his honor, his refusal to be anything other than himself, still stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is still room for something greater than blind obedience. There is still room for choice, because Leman Russ was never just a warrior. He was a force, a storm, a wildfire, something that could never be truly tamed. And that, more than anything else, is why his legend will never die. Leman Russ is a paradox, a warrior and a king, a savage and a strategist, a man of instinct who still carried an unshakable sense of duty. Of all the Primarchs, he was the hardest to predict, the most difficult to understand. He could be reckless, impulsive, and brutally direct. Yet at the same time, he was fiercely loyal, deeply thoughtful in his own way, and burdened by the choices he made. And maybe that's why he remains one of the most fascinating figures in Warhammer 40k, because you can never truly pin him down. Unlike some of his brothers, Russ didn't seek power for its own sake. He didn't chase knowledge like Magnus, he didn't try to build a perfect empire like Leman, and he didn't lose himself in bitterness and isolation like the Lion. Russ was something different. He lived for the fight, but not just any fight, the right fight. He was never a mindless killer, never a warlord without a cause. Every battle, every war, every decision he made was driven by something deeper, something primal, honor, loyalty, the unspoken code that bound him to his warriors, his brothers, his people. That's what makes him so unpredictable. Because while other Primarchs followed logic, doctrine, or ambition, Russ followed his gut. And no one, not even the Emperor himself, could ever truly predict what he would do next. One moment, he was laughing with his brothers. The next, he was tearing down their cities in fire and blood. One moment, he was the Emperor's most devoted executioner. The next, he was vanishing into the unknown, chasing a battle that no one else could see. Some say he was just a weapon, a tool shaped for war and destruction. But if that were true, he would have never hesitated. He wouldn't have felt the weight of Prospero, wouldn't have carried the burden of the choices he made. And that's the key to understanding Leman Russ. He wasn't just a force of nature, he cared. About his warriors. About his people. About what was right even when it was impossible to define. And that's why his story isn't over. Because even now, 10,000 years later, his name still carries weight. His warriors still wait for him, still tell the tale of the Wolf Time, still believe that their king will return when they need him most. Maybe it's just a myth, a story to keep hope alive in a galaxy that has long since lost its way. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the truth. Maybe Russ is still out there, hunting in the darkness, waiting for the moment when his Imperium truly needs him. Because if there's one thing we know for certain, it's that Leman Russ doesn't follow orders. He doesn't return because he's supposed to. He returns when he decides the time is right. And when that happens, it won't be a quiet return. It will be a storm, a reckoning, a final hunt that will shake the galaxy to its core. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. Because Leman Russ was never just a Primarch, he was a legend. and legends never die.